Hello, and welcome back to the Healthy Shift Worker podcast. Today, we've got a return guest coming onto the show, and I've only done that a couple of times. It's a pretty special occasion. We've got the lovely Dr. Emily Manoogian joining us all the way from California in the United States. So, welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we had a terrific conversation, I remember, back in episode 110, where we talked about your Healthy Heroes study, which involved the firefighters and eating on night shift. And I think that kind of really sparked a lot of great conversation and definitely sparked the interest of our listeners. But we're kind of steering in a similar direction, but slightly different on today's conversation because you've just published another exciting randomized clinical trial on time restricted eating in adults with metabolic syndrome. And I'm excited to talk about that because so many shift workers unfortunately have that condition, metabolic syndrome. So I guess let's just go straight into it. And what led you to going down that path of deciding time restricted eating for metabolic syndrome?
Yeah,
And what
so
is metabolic syndrome? Sorry, just so two parts to that. Yeah, just for
yeah,
clarification.
no, great question. So metabolic syndrome is really a combination of any three of five factors, and those five factors are elevated waist circumference, elevated triglycerides, low HDL or good cholesterol, um, elevated fasting glucose, and elevated blood pressure. And if you have any three of those five, you're considered to have metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome, like you said, it affects not just a lot of shift workers, it affects many adults. I think in the US, by the time you hit 60, it's like over 60 to 70% of people have metabolic syndrome. And so this is really like, it's usually a pre diabetic state, high risk for cardiovascular events. And the really kind of scary thing is like, especially from the pre diabetes view, once you get pre diabetes, there's a really high, it's almost guaranteed that you're going to lead towards type 2 diabetes in the next few years. And obviously, it's not a guarantee, but if things don't change, that's pretty much where people are going. It's just kind of a matter of time.
Yeah.
And diabetes also leads into more cardiovascular events like heart attacks, strokes, and all those kinds of things that we want to avoid. So we know it's extremely common. And we kind of saw this as a place where there really was more need for intervention to either delay the onset of this progression or prevent it altogether. And we thought time restricted eating may be a good fit because we know that it affects weight, we know that it affects blood pressure, we know that it affects glucose regulation. It's hitting almost all of the five factors. And so we got really excited about this opportunity of maybe this was a new behavioral lifestyle intervention that could be a co-treatment. And that was one of the other things we were really excited about in the study was a lot of these people are already on medication, so it doesn't have to be one or the other, that they could be done together. Um, and it could be used as a way of, really kind of targeting this kind of middle ground where you're not into a full disease state, but you're really at quite high risk. And maybe that's something we could do to help people. And so, yeah, that's how we ended up getting into the study.
Mm. So a very much needed study, clearly,
Yeah.
from the percentage of what you're saying, yeah, over 65% of adults, yeah, which is huge. So do you mind, I guess, if we maybe just as a bit of a refresher for our listeners, even those that may not have caught your first episode, but could you give us a bit of a breakdown of time restricted eating? What exactly is it and how does it work?
Yeah.
And
So,
then, yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, and then what parameters that you chose in your study as well, under that banner of time restricted eating.
Gotcha. Yeah, so time restricted eating is really just restricting all of your dietary intake into a consistent daily period. And really, if you're thinking big picture, it's really just when are you active? When are you normally awake? When are you, usually daylight hours? I know that's a little complicated for shift work, but
Mm.
in general, when we're speaking, especially in this trial, it's eat when you're active, let your body rest and not take in those nutrients and allow it to, fast and rest at night as it's designed to. I think that's the big picture kind of idea. In practice, that looks like something like eating within an 8 or 10 hour consecutive window. So something like 9 a.m. to 7 p.m., or maybe 10 to 6, or you could make all the derivatives you want. Um, And we don't set a specific time for our participants. So it should be
Okay.
relative to your schedule, because
Mm,
unlike other forms of fasting, time restricted eating is really aimed at optimizing the circadian system and
mm,
telling your body what time of day it is by eating at the same time and giving that cue to all the clocks throughout your body and your metabolic system that this is when we eat, and you give it a consistent fast, because the circadian system is anticipatory. So it's super important to have that be a regular time. And so again, it's not like when we say time restricted eating, it's interesting because it's just time restrictive. There's no caloric restriction. I mean, you could combine it, but it's not necessary. It's not like part of the actual intervention. And it's really just saying let's keep all your food within a specific time.
mm.
Um, and then the parameters we were looking at for this study, our primary outcome was HbA1c, which is hemoglobin A1c, which is really this measure that's about a 3-month average of what your glucose levels are. And this is kind of the gold standard for assessing glucose regulation in individuals. And this is usually the measure that's used to diagnose diabetes. I find it much more reliable than like a fasting blood glucose, because fasting blood glucose can change a lot based on what you ate the days before, how active you were that day, what quality of sleep you got. Like these things can fluctuate a lot. And we've done other studies where, we have participants taking finger pricks, and I've tried it on myself, and day to day in the morning, you can get a lot of variation on fasting glucose. So something like A1C, which is a little bit more robust measure, it doesn't fluctuate quite as much, is a little bit more reliable. So those were our primary outcomes. We had a series of secondary outcomes looking at glucose regulation, including fasting blood glucose, insulin, and we also use continuous glucose monitors, so we could see how people's glucose change. We get a measure every 5 minutes for 10 days rather than, just a one-time assessment, so we can see how they respond to food. And then other cardiometabolic markers like LDL cholesterol, LDL particle number. And in this study, we also did full body composition scans. So we did a DEXA scan so we could see bone mass, lean mass, fat composition in every part of the body, and really get an idea of how the body is changing.
Great. So yeah, I love that holistic take that you are, even though that main focus was the HbA1c, but you are looking at the other things, which helps just to give us a better picture. And obviously with this, the circadian timing system taking into consideration with that is huge, even for those that aren't, officially shift workers. I think we can probably safe to say that a lot of us are morphing into shift workers, even though you're not clocking
Absolutely.
on as a shift worker. People are working these long, crazy hours now, aren't they?
Yeah, and even if your work schedule isn't crazy, I think in modern society, a lot of us have jobs and are also parents and are or
Exactly.
caretakers of some other sort. And if anyone's ever had a newborn, you have been a shift worker at some point in your life. I think
Yeah.
all of us have to work these kind of insane schedules, or, work,
Yeah.
quote unquote, work these insane schedules to take care of our loved ones, or do some kind of job, or have some other responsibility that does put us in this kind of shift work lifestyle, but we're not always called shift workers on paper. And so I think understanding how we can optimize our rhythms that were commonly challenging so much is important for everyone, not just shift workers.
Yeah, totally. I refer to those as the unpaid shift working workforce of the
Yeah.
world that
Yeah.
don't have that. Yeah. So how long was this study, Emily? And like how many participants were involved?
Yeah, so this was a study that lasted 3 months. So we do a little over
Okay.
3 months. We have a 2-week baseline period and a 3-month intervention.
Hmm.
And we had 122 participants recruited and 108 of them completed, split between two arms. So half were in a kind of a standard of care group where they were given just standard lifestyle advice that you would normally receive at a doctor's
Yep.
office if you had metabolic syndrome. And then the time restricted eating group received that same advice, but they also were assigned an 8 to 10 hour eating window. And we chose 8 to 10 hours based on what their eating window was at baseline. So if they had an eating window of 14 hours or longer, a daily 14-hour window or longer, they would go down to 10 hours. If it was 13 hours, they'd go to 9. If it was 12, they would go to 8. If they had a shorter than 12-hour eating window at baseline, we considered them, that they were excluded for the study because they had too short of an eating window to start with. And so we were
Chat.
looking for, typically long eaters, which based on our other research is over 50% of individuals. And actually, in this study, I think we maybe excluded maybe 3% of participants due to short eating window. It was a very small number of people that were excluded because their eating windows were too short.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
it is quite common to have a long eating window. And
Yeah.
so it was just, being able to restrict that in those individuals. And the reason we did the 4-hour shift of 8 to 10 is because it is only 3 months. We needed to see some kind of significant change. And so it was personalized to the individual in that way. And each person got to pick their own eating window that fit their schedule specifically.
I think that's pretty powerful. You've done that. Obviously, more likely they're going to have that compliance, aren't they? That they're going to stick to it because they're choosing
Yeah,
that.
I think a big part of this is feasibility, right? Like, even
Yeah.
if you told me,
Yeah.
the best way to be healthy is to eat between 6 a.m. and 2 p.m., I'd be like, well, that's nice, but it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Yeah.
been a problem with a lot of behavioral interventions is
Mm,
it might theoretically be great, but
yeah.
if people can't do it, it really doesn't matter. And that's been one of the really exciting things about TRE in general is that I
Mm,
think it's not like the only way to be healthy. There's many different ways to be healthy, and it
yeah.
might, especially on a shift work schedule, maybe it doesn't work for you. But it's another way that you could potentially help support your health. And for people that maybe some of these other interventions don't work, like
Mm,
getting enough exercise in or dieting or eating a specific diet, maybe those things either they're not able to do it or they aren't sufficient.
mm,
This is another layer of something that we can add on to that. And I do think it's kind of a core pillar of health. But I think if you do enough good things, it kind of works out no matter what. So hopefully this is something that's accessible, and it's pretty
yeah.
easy to figure out the time that would work for you. We do require that your eating window has to stop at least 3 hours before your typical bedtime,
Yeah.
and that's really to allow your body to rest and be able to go to sleep without your glucose levels staying really high. There's a lot of good research showing, like in lab studies with controlled meals, that if you raise glucose before you go to sleep, instead of coming back down as you normally would, they stay elevated for much
Mm,
longer, even in someone who is healthy.
mm,
And so we don't want that to happen. We want to make sure you can get a good quality sleep and that your glucose is regulated properly. And that gets into melatonin and insulin and all kinds of other stuff that changes
mm,
at night.
mm.
So we do require that. And then the way that we have participants choose is we say identify any meals you can't miss. And usually almost all the time it's a family meal at night. And so it's
Huh?
really like pick when your dinner is going to be and then kind of
Yeah.
count backwards. And that's usually how we get it to fit in. So if I tell someone to not have dinner with their family, I think I'm just setting them up to fail. So it's like
Yeah.
identify when that meal is going to be, and then let's count
Yeah.
backwards and we'll figure it out from there. And that usually is 9 to 7, I think, is our most common 10-hour window. And we saw that in the firefighter study as well, that,
Yeah.
it's usually something around there, or maybe 1 hour one way or the other, but you don't usually see too much of a shift beyond that.
It's so true because you do have to take into consideration, yeah, the practicalities, and having dinner with family is important, particularly if, been working long hours and that. And by removing that is sort of taking a part of enjoyment out of your life, isn't it? When things can be pretty challenging as well. So, what were the main key findings that you found from the study? That's I'm a bit excited about that.
Yeah. So we saw a lot of cool things. So again, I think it's important to note that these participants they all had metabolic syndrome, and we did
Yep.
require that elevated glucose was one of the parameters that they had.
Yeah. Yep.
So everyone here was a pre-diabetic state. And so that's why our primary outcome was HbA1c, to really look at glucose changes. And we saw a
Yep.
full zero point 0.1 decrease. A1c is measured in percentage, and so it's a 0.1% decrease, but it's not a percent of the score. It's like a point drop.
Yep.
Um, and it seems like a subtle amount, but these people are starting at like just barely pre-diabetic. So pre-diabetic state is a 5.6, and our participants on average were 5.87. So they were on the very mild side of it. And we saw them come down 0.1, which was exciting to see because when you look into the data, right now, the kind of gold standard for care for prediabetes is the Diabetes Prevention Program, which
Hmm.
is a 6-month long intervention. It requires coaches. There's many meetings, one-on-one and group sessions, for dietary counseling, where there's caloric restriction. There's a goal of a 7% weight loss, and you also have to exercise 150 minutes a week. And so it's a pretty intensive lifestyle intervention. Um, but that intervention has been pretty successful. It still has a lot of room to grow because a large proportion of people do not achieve the weight loss that they'd like to achieve. And again, I
Yeah.
think this gets back to feasibility of increasing that much physical activity and diet long term. But that program is currently the most successful one out there. And the cool thing was that they also saw exactly the same change that we did. In fact, their participants started right at the same amount. I think it was also at 5.9, like they were right there. And they also saw a 0.1% decrease. The really exciting part about that was you could say, okay, it's maybe a delay or a small prevention, but they're pretty stable. But those measures are in comparison to the control groups. So the control groups also might get slightly better, and there's that much better than the controls. But the cool thing about the DPP is they also did a follow up 2 years later, and they found that the incidence of progression to type 2 diabetes decreased by 58%. And so we're excited that this is maybe a potential nether mechanism that could
Mhm.
either be added on to the DPP or used in place of the DPP, for people that
Mm.
aren't, having the success that they'd want to have with it, or even the people
Mm.
that are having success with it. Maybe this would make it better, or be, like there's no reason to think that one would replace the other. They should easily be able to work together to do TRE and exercise and good diet quality. All of these things would be complementary to each other. So we think this could either be an additive, or for those that aren't able to do that, an alternative to it. And I think there's some important other things to think about here. So, these participants, most of our participants were already on metformin, which is probably the most common drug used for prediabetes. And the diabetes prevention program also had an arm where they tested metformin alone, and metformin had only a 0.07% decrease in A1C. So it does have a small decrease as well, but it wasn't as significant as the lifestyle interventions. But it was exciting to see that we saw these changes on top of that medication. So this was
Yeah.
in conjunction with these participants were already stable on those kinds of things.
Mm.
Um, so all those things are important, or were exciting to see. And then when we looked at other measures, our secondary outcomes, we also saw improvements in glycemic variability, both within a day and between days. We were really excited about that because we've seen that before. We saw it in the firefighter study. We've seen it in other trials where we've had continuous glucose monitoring, that TRE decreases glycemic variability. And that's really important because when we look at kind of long-term health outcomes where this population is kind of going, is in individuals with type 2 diabetes, even when A1C is controlled, if you have high glycemic variability, that's associated with a lot of cardiovascular events, like heart attacks and strokes. And so we know lower glycemic variability has long term health benefits. So we're excited to see that decrease in the TRE group. And then we also saw significant decreases in LDL cholesterol, LDL particle number, and body fat percentage, which was really cool because we didn't see a significant change in bone mass. So the bone mass was able to stay the same, lean mass was able to stay the same, but we saw that weight loss really in the fat. And so that was all super exciting because, again,
Yeah.
a lot of our participants were already on statins. Their LDL was already actually in a reasonable range. So to see a decrease on top of that, as well as the decreases in body fat, especially without any type of lean mass loss, was really exciting to see. Because a lot of times, especially in an older population, you'll see weight loss, but then you'll also lose a lot of lean mass, and we don't want to,
Yeah.
we don't want that to happen. And so losing
Mm.
weight in kind of a healthier way, where it's a subtle amount of weight loss, but it's primarily fat, was
Mm.
really exciting to see. And again, because these people were not told to eat less, they this was not a dietary or caloric restriction intervention. So to see that weight loss without kind of explicitly trying to diet, I think is super important because it's very hard to change some of these habits. And, restrict food doesn't work for everyone. So to have another option for that, we think is really exciting.
Yeah, yeah. So looking at that, then we can see that time restricting eating certainly is not contributing to the body breaking down. It's not putting it in that, catabolic state, is it? Which some people we might think, oh, you're not eating, it's going to negatively affect the body, but no, it does the opposite.
Yeah. No, I mean, we think that it's really helping the metabolic system thrive, right? And a big part of
Mm.
that is you might be in a catabolic state, but like you store energy all the time. I mean, your liver fills up with glucose
Yeah.
that, when insulin's in your body and it's taking glucose out of your blood and it's putting it into the liver, it's storing it up to be used while you're sleeping. And
Yeah.
we're built to not be eating constantly. We don't need to constantly be eating, right? Our
Right.
body is built to kind of use the glucose, store extra away, and then at night release that glucose back out. And I think when we think about losing fat,
Mm.
if you're eating all the time, you're never going to get in a state where your body's going to break down the fat that you stored, right? And
Yep.
again, we're not doing long-term fasting here. We're talking
Mm.
about maybe 14 to 16 hours max, and 8 of those
Mm.
hours you're asleep, right? So this is
Mm.
usually like 2 hours after you wake up, the first 2 hours after you wake up, and then the
Mm.
maybe 4 hours before you go to bed, and then the rest of the
Mm.
time you're asleep.
Mm.
So it's not like you're starving yourself by any means.
Totally.
Like a 9 a.m. to 7 p.m., that's a
Yeah.
pretty reasonable window of
Mm.
time.
Mm.
And so I don't think of this as like a starving state by any means. I feel like
Mm.
this is really just like helping your body do what it's meant to do and be able to break down the fat stores that you have. Everyone has some fat and you should be
Mm.
using it. And I think the problem comes, with this like starving yourself idea of like when you do these really long-term fasts, or maybe you even do an eating window that's like really late shifted, where your body's up and active for a long time and it's like, oh, hey, I'm not getting any nutrients and my insulin's back up and my glucagon's back down, and like I was
Mm.
expecting food now, and now it's like, okay, I got to break something down. Now maybe it's going at muscle. That's not what we're doing here. This is kind of a very mild alignment of really just
Mm.
supporting your natural rhythms to say, let's use energy we take in when we're active. Let's break down our extra fat stores at night, but it doesn't create this kind of starvation mode where you would be breaking down lean mass, at least as far as we're aware. We think that's, really aligning these rhythms to when your body's active. So you're not fasting for huge amounts in the morning and you're not fasting for huge amounts at night, that there are these really kind of very modest windows to just allow your body to wake up and be ready to process food in the morning, and then to really just get your glucose levels down before you go to sleep. Tell your body it's not time to, be awake and active. It's just, eating is a cue that it's time to wake up and be alert, and we're going to use all this energy. And so eating late at night really is kind of a negative thing. So we're just kind of relieving this negative signal. But yeah, it doesn't put you in such an extreme state that you're going to have these negative side effects, or at least that's our hypothesis at the moment. And that's what we've seen so far.
Yeah, which is really, really, really exciting. And I mean, let's face it, at the end of the day, especially if you're shift workers, but even not, we're just being really conditioned now to just eat constantly.
Yeah.
3 meals a day, snacks in between, we're being told, and then it gets into that behavioral thing if we're up late at night, watching a bit of TV. Oh,
Yeah.
fridge is just there. Let's kind of do together, isn't it? Like we've got to really change our lifestyle, our behaviors.
I mean, and there's so many. I mean, we eat for so many reasons that are not hunger or nutrient. I mean, most eating is, I feel, for pleasure or social
True.
interaction. Like it's a reward for something. It's
Mm.
it's a, oh, I'm gonna have a little treat tonight. It's this, like there's all these
Mm.
reasons why we eat that have nothing to do with nutrients or,
Yeah.
feeding ourselves. And so people think, oh, but you eat all the time. It's like, yeah, but do you really need to? And the nice
Yeah.
thing about TRE is like once you're on it for a while, because your system is anticipatory, you really do kind of shift your what you expect to happen. After a
Mm.
couple months, you don't expect to eat anymore. You don't get that hunger at night that maybe you've
Yep.
built up as far as a habit. And so it does kind of help you in that regard, um, get used to that new thing. But it is tricky. I mean, there are going to be days where you're going to eat late no matter what, because there are holidays and there are birthdays and there are
Yeah.
celebrations where you're going to have, or work events or
Yeah.
whatever it is, where you're
Totally.
going to have that later thing. And that's totally
Mm.
fine. Just like we have ice cream and cake and everything sometimes, it's just you shouldn't
Mm.
be eating those things every day and you shouldn't be eating late
Exactly.
every day. So
Exactly.
everything in moderation, and cheating occasionally is absolutely fine. Like we're all
Mm.
human. It's not going to be
Mm.
perfect. No one expects that.
Mm.
But I think getting it into, as regular as you can so your body can anticipate when it's going to eat and can prepare for it. I think that's kind of the goal, is trying to, keep it as healthy as you can on a regular basis.
Mm. And yeah, the time restricting concept is so good, Emily, as if you kind of spoken to before. It's not about calorie counting or having weighing food, or like it's not like it's time restricted eating, but that's kind of the only restriction to it
Yeah.
compared to
Yeah.
what you were saying before about the diabetes prevention program. Again, there's a myriad of different things that are trying to do the same thing. But when we take a step back and look at this one, yeah, it's pretty good. It's
I mean,
not,
I think that's why we've seen such positive response to it and why people get so
mm,
excited about it is like it's really simple in a way. You know, it's not saying you
yeah,
can't have that food, it's
exactly.
saying eat it a little bit earlier, like cut out
Yeah.
your after dinner snack, don't cut out your meals, you know. And I
Mm,
think that makes it a lot more reasonable for people. It makes it a lot more acceptable.
mm,
And again, not to say you couldn't combine it with a caloric restriction. I mean, the quantity and quality of food is absolutely important. Like,
yeah.
ideally, you're eating the right amounts
Yeah.
of food, good quality food, and at the right time.
Exactly. Yeah.
But regardless of if you do those other things, you should still see a benefit by optimizing the when, you know, and
Mm,
the when is for some people the easiest thing to do, and to be fair, for some people is the hardest thing to do. And specifically, you know, shift work can sometimes make that extremely difficult. And because the schedules can be so complex and changing, I mean, we have ideas about what might be the best, but I think the field is still trying to figure out, like, okay, in this situation, what is the best eating pattern? You know, if you have
yeah.
someone who's on a regular schedule, you know, awake during the day and sleeping at night, day to day, we have a pretty good idea, like, this is what you should be doing. Once
Yeah.
you change that schedule around, you know, we don't have hard answers yet. We have ideas, but it's not fully understood the best way to optimize that. And again, it's going to come back in, at least in part, to feasibility, because if you
Mm.
can't do it, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, yeah, it's a work in progress. Now, and I spoke to you briefly about this before we went to air, but the reason why I've nabbed you and brought you on again is because I saw Dr. Sachin Panda, obviously from the Salk Institute, share your study on LinkedIn, and it's got a great graphic part of it. And I probably my listeners can't really see this. If you're going to watch YouTube, I'll put the link and everything down at the bottom there. But you've already spoken a little bit. It's you about the comparison of your study. So you spoke briefly about the diabetes prevention program, Metformin, time restricted eating, and one we haven't spoken about is the GLP-1 antagonists, like drugs like Ozempic. And what you've done is you've just really just compared that along with the time restricted eating. Could you talk to us about the Ozempic kind of comparison, because that's
Yeah,
obviously in such um yeah, it's in the limelight for sure at the
yeah,
moment, for
absolutely. I
sure.
mean, GLP-1s and drugs like Ozempic are really powerful, and for a lot of people, they're having huge benefits. Problem is, you know, it's not all great. I mean, there's lots of good data that's come out to show many different types of benefits. So you can get massive weight loss, you can get big improvements to glucose. So when we're talking A1C, you know, with a GLP-1 in a type 2 diabetic population, you can see something like a 0.34% decrease, which is like 3 times bigger than what we're seeing. I mean, that's a significant shift. Although when you're in a full type 2 diabetic realm, usually you're shooting for a zero point 0.5 is considered what you would want to see. So it's not quite there, but again, it's a significant decrease. Um, the problem with GLP-1s are a few things. One, they can have a lot of side effects.
Yeah.
So there are some long-term things that are being assessed, but they can have, you know, depending on if you have any other comorbidities, that you may not be eligible, especially in an aging population. If you're a little bit older, there may be issues where you wouldn't be able to take it at all. Second is, one of the very common side effects is nausea. So some people are just nauseated almost all the
Hmm.
time, which, you know, if you don't have that, that's great. But if you do, that can be a rough way to live. Um, the other thing is they're considered to be kind of a lifetime drug. So if you start taking it, it's not like you take it until you lose weight and you can get off of it. It's like, no, you're probably taking this for the rest of your life, which, if you're having negative side effects, may not be possible or just not desirable. And the other thing is they're extremely expensive, very,
Yeah.
very expensive. And depending on where you are, insurance has different coverage. So usually they're only prescribed for type 2 diabetes. They're not available for pre-diabetes or just weight loss in most cases, unless you would be at the point of bariatric surgery. Otherwise, they're usually not available without a type 2 diabetes diagnosis. Um, and also, it's unclear how these will be covered moving forward. I know in the US, there's a lot of politics around if Medicaid or Medicare could potentially cover it. I think that's something Biden's trying to put out, but you don't know how that's going to happen. You know, there's a lot of politics. I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of
Yeah.
politics behind what will or will not be covered.
Mm.
And they're extremely expensive in the United States. And there's also been shortages. It's actually a very complicated drug to make. And so all of these GLP-1s and GIP-1, like all the different agonists that are affecting that same system. They're actually a fairly complicated drug to make. So there have been shortages on and off with, other common drugs like Trulicity or Wegovy and Ozempic that sometimes can be hard to maintain. So it's complicated. I think they're a super powerful tool. I'm very excited about, the future of, what we'll kind of see how these progress, but they're still a very young drug. There clearly are some side effects as well. And the expense is something that, can make it impossible for some individuals. And especially depending on how insurance coverage plays out, it could make it, completely impossible or very accessible. And then it could be a shortage issue again. It just gets a little bit complicated. So I think really in the long term, they're going to be a great solution for some individuals, but they're not going to be really a possibility for everybody. And so we can't just say Ozempic's going to cure everything. We've really got to stick on some of these behavioral interventions. And I think
Right.
also where this is leading is really just saying, like, even if you are on a GLP-1, could you also do time restricted eating and maybe see better benefits or see less side effects, or maybe take a lower dose where maybe you would have less side effects because you're taking lower doses? I think there's a lot of room for combination with this, just the same way we saw in our current study, the combination with other common drugs, and just seeing that additional benefit of the time restricted eating as well.
Yeah, yep. And I noticed too, like one of the side effects you were saying with the likes of Ozempic can be the muscle loss as well. And
Yeah, and that
the
again, that becomes
opposite
because
type
it's
restricted eating.
usually it is a huge dramatic decrease in calorie intake. It's really a real big drop
Mm,
in calorie
mm,
intake, and usually that's just becomes a behavioral thing without having to try too hard because you completely lose your appetite. And sometimes that's with
yeah,
nausea, sometimes it's not, but the appetite just completely drops. So people are eating not very much,
yeah,
and so there's always this also risk of getting proper nutrition, because if you're not
yeah.
eating very much, you have to be very cautious about what you are eating to make sure you're getting the nutrients that you would need. Otherwise, you're going to end up in
Mm,
this state where you're kind of in malnutrition, and a couple bites of pizza is not going to give you the nutrients you need. Even if you only ate a couple bites and you're losing weight, that's not kind of a healthy way to lose weight.
mm-mm,
So the weight loss can be rapid, and for some individuals, that's really important, because if they're in a state where they have severe obesity and they really need to lose that weight, then it might be worth it, right? But I think anything, there's no magic drug that just makes you only healthier and has no side effects, unfortunately. And so when you are going to have something like this, proper nutrition and regular exercise are going to be really important to maintain that muscle mass, to make sure you're getting the nutrients you need so you don't get into this kind of starvation state. Because that's also not something that you can maintain long term. Once you do get out of that state, you're going to regain the weight. Um, and so I think again, it's really, I think, going to get to either, you know, feasible behavioral interventions, or more
yeah.
likely a combination of medications along with behavioral interventions to make those medications have less side effects, to help them be more effective, and to help you stay, kind of a healthier version of you on that medication.
Mm. Yeah, definitely some really, really good points there. One thing I did want to point out, and maybe this is going to be a little bit political, but this really did stand out for me, is that the cost from these programs. Now, you mentioned the first one was the diabetes prevention program. The annual cost to treat 100 million people with pre-diabetes through this diabetes prevention program was $50 billion. 50 billion. With
Mm-hmm.
Metformin, it's 6 billion. With time restricted eating, it's potentially zero. And with drugs like Ozempic, it's $1.2 trillion. So if we to take a step back and look at this and think, wow, if we know if we're following the bit of the money trail here, what's going to be pushed the most? I think, yeah, I think as humans, we need to sort of just maybe sit on that and ponder that for the moment, because when things are just always about making money, doesn't necessarily it is in your best interest.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. And, to be fair, if you're going to implement TRE on like a wide scale, it would probably have some type of implementation that would not be a zero cost, right? I mean, anyone could just do it for free.
Yeah.
But you could argue someone could just do more exercise and change of diet quality for free as well.
Mm,
But most lifestyle interventions require some kind of coaching, right? And
mm,
that coaching is usually
yeah.
what's billable or something along those
Yeah.
lines. But those things are much cheaper, and also it's,
Mm,
you know, it's a train a person to fish rather than giving them fish kind of situation.
absolutely.
Where if you can train
Yeah.
someone within a few months, then you're not paying that for the rest of your life.
Mm,
Whereas a medication like this, or, you know,
mm,
just like statins or anything else, a lot of these are lifetime medications. And when you get into a lifetime medication status, then, you know, we're talking decades of billing. We're not talking a few months.
mm,
And so, yeah, the money does shift, and some of it is, you know, you always got to look at the drivers, but also again, it's a very expensive drug to make. Like it's hard to make, and if you're constantly having to take it, you're constantly having to pay for it, so it adds up. It just really does. And then, you know, it gets into politics of drug expenses in different countries. It really does vary by country to country. There's all kinds of politics behind that, and beyond what I'm an expert in, but I do know that is a complicated field. But it is something to keep in mind as far as we're talking feasibility when we're talking about epidemics, really, of or endemics of
mm,
obesity, of metabolic syndrome, of
mm.
diabetes.
Yeah.
What is feasible? Like, what are people actually? What kind of care can people get? And
Mm,
if you can't get the care, then it's kind of a moot point if it works or not. And so
mm.
I think what we're
Yeah.
seeing so far is for some it'll work, for some, there might be physical reasons why they can't. Some might have financial reasons why they can't, or a combination. And so we just got to keep finding ways to make those treatments better. If we can do some kind of collaborative treatment, you know, to make it even simpler or lower doses, or just to find an alternative, because there's no one answer to any problem. You know, humans are so heterogeneous and physically and, you know, just socioeconomically and culturally,
Yeah.
there's just going to be things that are just absolute miracles for some people that will not work for others. And
Mm.
so we can't think one thing is going to solve everything. We've got to make sure we keep diverse options,
Yeah.
and hopefully complementary options where people can try multiple things. Something like TRE that is theoretically free. You know, you could try to do it yourself.
Mm.
Um, and also really safe. From what we've seen, there haven't been any safety concerns.
Yeah.
Um, that it's
Yeah.
something that we can try. And to be fair, and just as a note, we've never tried this in individuals with type 1 diabetes. We don't include women who are pregnant or breastfeeding. So there are
Mm-hmm.
some, you know, chronic
Mm-hmm.
diseases that obviously have not been tested. But from what we have tested, metabolic syndrome, and obesity studies have never shown any kind of safety concerns with time restricted eating, especially of 8 to 10 hours. It does seem to be completely safe. And so, you know, when you have those kinds of, you know, non-invasive, free to try, really safe, it's exciting that you could say, try it yourself, you know, try it for a couple months, see how you're feeling and see if it works for you, try moving it around. And I think though that's one of the reasons why it's really exciting is, you know, most people can do it and they can just start it at home whenever they're ready.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. It is exciting, and it's I guess liberating for some people too to know that there are these different options. And you're right, like a lot of people, because it can involve quite a shift and change in their current behaviours. So working with a coach or of some description, a wellness coach can help you. But again, the cost can not be huge because it might just be temporary as well. So I just love that you are bringing this focus on this particular type of way to help with people with metabolic syndrome, with it, whether it's pre-diabetes and so forth. It is super exciting. So I guess on that note, just I guess as we kind of look at wrapping up the discussion, Emily, what's the next step in your research on time restricted eating? Where's the? I know you're so busy doing all different things, but I think there is something exciting brewing in the background.
Yeah, so we're really excited to get our next study started, specifically looking at nurses and nursing assistants that work night shifts. And so this is a 7
Wonderful.
a.m. or 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, 3 or 4 days a week. And we're going to be trying time restricted eating during the day, a combination of time restricted eating with a low glycemic snack at night, or a complete kind of control where we're just doing dietary monitoring. And we're going to look for weight loss. We're again going to do these DEXA body scans where we can look at body composition to see what types of weight loss is
Mhm.
actually happening. Is it fat versus muscle, or bone, or whatever else? As well as continuous glucose monitors, and really keeping an eye on glycemic regulation that we know is going to be really challenged on a night shift schedule. So we're really excited to get that started. And I'll also say, for anyone who's interested in understanding their rhythms or trying this at home, our lab does run a smartphone application called My Circadian Clock, which is what we use for all our clinical trials, but it's also available for anyone in the world to use. It's completely non-commercial, non-profit. Your data is not sold to anyone. It's just for research, but you can find it on your any iPhone or Android Play Store, wherever you download your apps, and it's free to use. And it kind of sets you up to assess what your current eating habits are for 2 weeks, and then you can set goals to try to change your eating window, and you can kind of track what you're eating and when you're eating it. And so that's a tool anyone could use for free. And if you're interested in just learning more, our website also, which is just mycircadianclock.org, has a lot of information about the science behind time restricted eating and circadian rhythms. That is another resource for people to have.
Yeah, wonderful. That is super exciting to actually be choosing a particular shift working occupation like nurses, and let's face it, so many nurses around the world. So yeah, that is really exciting. So I guess is there anything else that you'd like to add then, Emily, that we may have not spoken about that you think that would benefit our listeners, just based on whether the study that you've just done or anything
That's
in
a
the
great
future?
question. I think we covered most of it, but I would just say, finding your own personalized eating window is pretty easy. I think it's really kind of like 4 steps, and I'll just go through them super fast because I think it's easy enough to do if you're like, what should my eating window be? So step one is identify when you sleep. I know for shift work this could fluctuate and could be tricky, but on your non-work days, identify when you sleep. Then wait at least 1 hour after you wake up and stop eating at least 3 hours before bed. So now you've got a 12-hour window, assuming you sleep around 8 hours. So that's step two. Step three would say identify any meals you can't miss. So maybe it's a family dinner at 6 or 7. And then count backwards. Go to, say 10 hours before that. And then that's your eating window. Hopefully that should be aligned to when you're active. It should allow for eating with family. It should allow for your body to wake up to be able to process glucose, and also then, stop eating to be able to get a sleep. And it's really as simple as that. It's giving yourself that little bit of fast in the morning so your body's ready, and then letting your body calm down and fast it while you're sleeping so you can process your food properly. And I think just those simple things really make a huge difference. And so I recommend you to figure out at least what you think your eating window should be, and challenge yourself to figure out when you do eat. Humans are really bad at remembering when we eat. We've kind of found this. I found this with myself. I study this. I'm obsessed with it. And even I will sometimes forget when I ate. I mean, it's very hard to do. Our brain does not save that much information because we've got other stuff to worry about. So, tracking your food for a couple of weeks to identify what your eating habits really are. And then once you see that, you can kind of target like, oh yeah, maybe I do snack after dinner. Maybe that's something I could cut out, or maybe I could wait 30 more minutes in the morning to have something. These little changes, it shouldn't be this huge dramatic difference. It should really be a matter of kind of a little bit of a delay in the morning and a little bit of an advance at night, and kind of cutting out these unnecessary eating events that, I think those small changes could actually have a pretty big effect.
Yeah, really, really great advice, Emily. And I just made me think too, sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming when you are shift working and you're doing all different shifts, but you can even try starting to do that when you're on leave for a week or two, and just,
absolutely.
When you're a normal person.
Yeah, I mean, you could, try doing it just on your off days, I think that's a reasonable thing to start.
Yeah.
And I think it may be more challenging just because your body's moving around, so you might have different energetic needs. You might be sleeping during the day, where this could get slightly more complicated.
Yep.
And I think because there's so many different types of shift schedules, there's so many different versions, and even the amount of physical activity required on shift varies dramatically. Some people are extremely active and some are more sedentary because that's what the job requires. So, figuring out what's right for you and playing with it, I think, is really important, and testing some of these things out. And that's another reason why I say observe yourself for a couple weeks, because I think that's really the best place to start, is identify where you are, and then look at it and say, are there places where I could change, or am I already doing the best I can? And you really don't know that till you take an assessment, which is why we start all of our studies with a 2-week baseline assessment to see where people are. And so I think that's really a first step. And then, assess it, see if that maybe TRE is something you can do on off days. I think that's a great place to start, and then see how it goes for you, and learn how to listen to your body a little bit more and try
Yeah.
to think about, do I need to eat because I'm hungry, or am I eating because I'm tired, or am I eating because
Bored.
I'm sad, or am I eating because it sounds fun, or am I eating because someone
Yeah.
else is eating,
Yeah.
and thinking about, I think mindful eating is not a new concept here. We're not inventing, that's a much, bigger thing. But,
Yeah.
combining that I think is really important, because again, I think we all eat usually not for sustenance reasons.
Yeah.
And so it's something to think about, and, making that self-evaluation I think is a really powerful first step.
Mm. Yeah. Excellent advice. And it's not about being perfect, but it's being, the best that we can for the majority of the time. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
brilliant advice. So, where for any of our listeners that might be interested in learning more about you, the work that you're doing in this upcoming study, where can they go, Emily?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, mycircadianclock.org. You
Hmm.
can also follow me on Twitter, just at Emily Manoogian. And that's usually where most things you can find, or you could always look us up on, Google Scholar or PubMed to find our most recent works. Most things are open access, where you're able to read the paper yourselves.
Yeah,
No
brilliant,
access.
excellent. Well, I'll make sure I'll pop those in the show notes. So, yeah, but thank you again for joining me for a second chat. It's I love talking about all things circadian biology and time restricting eating and everything with you. And I'm just chuffed that there's so many researchers like yourself out there that are doing some wonderful, wonderful work, shining the light, pardon the pun, on this area of science. It's wonderful. So please keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much for having. It was great being back, and it's always really fun talking to you about all this. So, yeah, this is really a pleasure. And thank you for highlighting the work and helping spread the word. I think that's super important.
Great, great. Thank you. Well, that's it for today's episode, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me, and until next time.